Hello, everyone. Hello, and thank you for coming. This is the third and last day of this short series, Discourse on Methods. And the small text that I put to precede this, I've said a few remarks at the opening of the first day and the second day. And whilst the title is borrowed from Descartes, who we often think of as the kind of his skeptical doubt as a foundation of the scientific method, there's much more, I think, in that when we bring it into the present day that resonates and is purposeful for design research. And across the school, I think in all aspects of the school, we share aspects of design research that are concerned both with making the world a better place and that we tread more lightly on the earth, but also that we question and reposition our relation to the natural world. And there are three particular words, I think, which are going to be very important for today's discussion, which I've taken directly from Descartes. That there's a chain of reasoning, a way of thinking that brings together intuition, deduction, and logic. Mm-hmm. And that the object of inquiry, the thing that we're investigating and reinventing, requires enumeration. Enumeration has a particular meaning in philosophy, but in ordinary language, it's just the stating of things one after the other. In particular, the way we think about it, then we can think of that as aspects of relationships that are to do with the object of inquiry. And I'll return to that when we open the debate. So the way this goes is two presentations will follow one after the other. And then I'll start with an initial question, which I'll ask the debating team, that is either the leaders of the program or their students, to respond to. And then we'll start this discussion. Okay, so Spatial Performance and Design, AAIS.
Thank you.
Over to you.
The beginning point of us is that we feel like people who are at home in more than one discipline. So most of us, and you know from yourself probably as well, you define yourself not only as architects or designers or artists, but actually as a sum of all those things. And not only the sum, actually an exponential way of working between those things. So in a way, this was a desire when we started the course now 15 years ago, that this becomes a home for people who feel that they have more areas of investigation to bring into a school of architecture, and have a field of investigation where they actually, through applied projects, prove different kind of areas of disciplines between the disciplines. The kind of people we are here is just a snapshot from an event last year where all the tutors sat together. And again, we can't just say one kind of discipline for each of them. It's, for example, if you look at Mona, stage designer and architect, Olivier, musician and actor, Hila, a journalist and architect, or artists and sculptors and choreographers like Renaud here next to me, David, of course, you all know as an art historian and singer. So already kind of from the outset how we start, we are a group of people which have overlaps of interests, often within design and architecture, but overall kind of span a network that is going beyond one single field at all times, already just by the discussions we have. The way of working we have is something where we try to avoid a priori decisions. So where things are not just starting with the idea you work towards, but actually it emerges because of the negotiation and discussions you have. So the process we're describing as one of our main bases of methods would be from a priori to out of thick air. A priori, we kind of all know, and this is a discussion we have for a long time, is this what a young designer often is told he does. There's this one big vision, the kind of, fountainhead, you have the vision and nobody should disturb it. You work towards it without any kind of compromise and any negotiation. However, we know that this is, of course, a moderated thing in reality. you always have to detour from this kind of one vision. You have to negotiate at all times. But it's told often, or it used to be told to designers, that it's undesirable to have this kind of detours. That actually this is what you have to avoid with all forces, that your art comes through, that you're the visionary, the genius. And I think these images from Fountainhead explain that really well. He can't accept the client's wish, and he has to kind of bring it back to his own vision. The next step in this kind of development was something we developed over the diploma unit we did run 15 years ago, which is that we say if there is not just a single outcome, we might as well see every step in between of negotiation as a full-fledged project. So every moment from the first drawing to the kind of experiments, to exhibitions, towards a final outcome is willfully inviting negotiation and new networks and new collaborations, so that detours are actually envisioned and invited at every step. So, but not with the pure purpose of going ahead, but actually that at that moment you could stop and you already have a project that satisfies you and can be defined as such. However, this still had for us this one thing. You still had this carrot ahead of you. You still were looking at the final outcome as the desirable thing to work towards to. Even if you detour it and maybe the final outcome is not recognizable as an initial idea, the step-by-step development of it still would have this kind of linear enumeration, and it would be one after the other, and you'd compare it still to the original outcome. So these would be projects which we did ourselves, but as well in many architectural practice nowadays it's kind of becoming norm that you actually have projects in between, that you actually make sure that you have a consultational project or projects which are prototypical on things you're doing. The Brussels Schweizerplatz project we did, for example, or other projects where actually the exhibition promoting bigger projects were the main kind of task for us in between, yet led on to bring people to a common ground already and having discourse of how to develop projects which are often stuck like for a long time in the way forward. What is the last step to do? Take the final carrot away. Stop being in a enumeration and actually start from multiple angles at the same time. So this is the process we call out of the air, which is a process we see as not starting with a final outcome, but searching for initiatives. Because in the creative world, the main thing is that there are so many like-minded people, often underconnected, with some resources, but not enough. Good ideas, but not the right connections in every point. So if you bring these initiatives together, you might create quite amazing projects, just by serendipity and synchronicity of different projects. The interesting thing is that this starting point then all of a sudden can be any size. It can be a book, it can be an exhibition, it can be a performance, or it can be actually a huge urban project. The direction is not preset anymore. Now, even a big kind of urban project which was frozen for 30 years, all of a sudden can initiate 15 exhibitions, 2 performances and 1 book. And all of them are then the satisfying outcomes. The important thing is here that the behavior changes. By default, you have to be multidisciplinary. By default, you have to kind of overlap with others and find the kind of equal areas of investigation, but as well differences. Because if you're all the same, it doesn't matter that you work together, then you actually are just becoming competition. So in ideal cases, it's a process which we call overlapping frequencies. You have areas of investigation which are equal and similar, but others where you teach each other. Hence as well, the title of our studio is interprofessional rather than interdisciplinary studio. Interprofessional means that you not necessarily work on the area of investigation you're best at, but you are teaching the others your best practice. Whereas they bring their knowledge to what you do and transform it therefore from the outset. It's a term which comes from medicine mainly, where for example an optometrist would work with an osteopath, and one is usually the bone cracker and the other one has to be extremely sensitive with eyes. And all of a sudden, the different kind of sensibility has to be brought to the different areas in the medicine. it's actually very successful, long-time practice now in medicine to be taught.
Okay, so of course the reference, I think we heard that as well on 2 days ago. So of course we always refer to Bauhaus and Black Mountain School. And for us, it's not the AIS is staging something or just have the fashion in mind. So it's always a kind of the framework around it as well. So that's why I choose that one this morning, because as well, like they are standing on top of the Dessau building, so kind of like Gropius, very important building. But for us, it's more important the initiators and the actants on site as well. Of course, Black Mountain School, so Cage and Cunningham already working really interdisciplinary, so from music to dance to film, they combined everything in a teaching program as well. And my favorite teacher, Albers, came of course from Bauhaus and then led some programs as well in the Black Mountain School. So all the references you got as well in the studio, of course, it's related to that as well. So our program dealing with many disciplines, so important music as well. So all the students, some came from design, some come maybe from music, but they all have to work with the other discipline as well. And even designers have to create their own music, or they have to move in different ways. So like Cunningham as well, for us important movement, like the no knows very well, and related to space as well. So how do we deal with that? Of course, Pina, so like more recent, like as well linking music, dance, and theater as well. And all our students experienced that. They had to perform, like in movement, they had to speak, so they narrate as well. So all the elements were tested already in term 1. As well, the language. So if you bring many disciplines together, how do you create your own language? How you can discuss, how you have a dialogue if you're really from the sometimes opposite discipline. So it's a kind of, as you see, the references, Rybczynski, film director, then Kane, musician, as well, movement, like half Chumi, half, I don't remember, Eisenman on top. So like how you create your own language as well in saying, like spoken word, but then as well in reading, notation, and so on. As an initiator in the year, so not 100 years of Bauhaus, 90 years of Bauhaus, we initiated from London through the Goethe Institute with Jena and Weimar the kind of choreography festival. So we really worked 2 years on it. So 2009 was a festival. From 2007, we tried to get a EU grant. We managed to get it. So at the end, we had 5 different countries: France, Hungary, Germany, UK, and the 5th one, I don't know. I forgot. But as well, like how to create a festival in the new Italy, in the new realm as well. At that point, so we started with a program. So we got the grant. We got interdisciplinary students, which we approached for years. And luckily, they signed up for the program. And so we could create, at the beginning of 2009, with MTech together, some of the students from MTech, a huge extension of the theater in Jena. So for us, it's always important, the collaboration, but as well the other disciplines. So that's an image as well from a graphic designer who wanted to go into product design and created from our huge extension, the big inflatable as well, another element as close and or like as well with movement to connect the city and our new structure as well. Next one. The next year, maybe 4 was a discussion.
Yeah, but
okay. Okay, we have to move on. So you can see we have a lot of discussions as well in Covent Garden the next year. But then as well, we had 2 different spaces, the white space, the dark space, and as you can see, the different arrangements. The next one is a discussion place. So as well, the wooden structure created a different atmosphere than, as you could see, the hexagon light structure in the other place. Renaud and Joe were the first movers were performing in that space. So then we created all the connections, and as you can see, 15 years later, we work still together.
Yeah. I think this is really one of the important points, that these events become initiators. They actually are the ones who are forming our networks internally, like in the case in Covent Garden. Pretty much everybody on the staff at the moment work with us on that project. So David McAlmond, the New Movement Collective, who founded that at the moment. So it was a real initiating seed for the whole kind of way forward. But then as well internationally, like this project in Matadero, Madrid, where we started to be invited to bigger projects and have festivals across Europe, where we could form common grounds between different parties. And I think this is one of the important things that we came back and back again and again, not only due to performances, but actually to initiate contacts between the local community, the political parties, which actually created, because of this new cultural center, quite big discrepancies. And therefore, we as a common ground, as a neutral thing coming in from the outside, could form a link. These kind of things are still in place. This is more than 10 years ago now. So the market from local producers is still on the site every week. The restaurants we initiated there with them is still there, and so on and so forth. The other end of the spectrum is when it comes to agency which is not human. So which is when all of a sudden the performance itself should become the initiator of something as a link to nature, as a link to structure and objects. So this performance we on purpose did in a gallery in Sardinia without audience. But it happened during a solar eclipse, during a storm of more than 70 miles per hour. And we had 90 of these kind of pendulum structures reacting to the nature. But it was a moment which was uncreatable if it was just planned as a human interaction for audience, because it was just an overall operating thing on its own right. And that is the other end of the spectrum. So either it's a full extended network into humans, or it's as well the research into how actually different elements react to one another. Both can completely be defined as networks and completely defined as objects.
Yeah, evolved,
Yeah.
like in Ibiza and London.
Different stages, and then what we learned then from the objects and their behavior, we brought back to the city and created a performance together in the rhythm of the city, but influenced by the dynamics of the nature.
And with the element of live music as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can go, but
Yeah.
that's just...
I think, another point was obviously we all had to conquer the kind of world of COVID and international projects. One of the moments where it really this kind of idea out of the air was really extremely visible was in that moment, because no matter where we are, immediately we could do live events. When everything was in lockdown in Europe, Beijing and Shanghai still were open.
And Korea.
And Korea.
That's
so we
correct.
had live events in front of audience in Korea and in Beijing. We don't have a photo of that here now, but there was, like in a museum in Beijing, we had over 500 visitors per day, which was fascinating. But we were remote, yet local artists worked with our students on site to have this performance.
But as well, alumni, no? At that point was important that we created the worldwide network. So like even if we are not there, as you could see, we were sitting in London in front of the screen, but having alumni which went through the whole process, like working with us as well.
We
Just
stop on
as a-
this. We
yeah.
can run the movie. We have the webpage, which is built up in that way as well, to show that it's a series of events always taking place. The festival from us in March is coming up, but then another one as well in Lisbon later on in the year, in June. So all these events are going to take place in the next months. These are the events from our phase 2 over there,
there.
Catherine, for example,
Oh, yeah,
but as well from phase 1, and they're in parts taking place here at the A, but as well all over London in different venues. So do come to this webpage. You can get all the information there of each of the things. These will be constantly updated with those things evolving when there are new imagery, new test things, and like that. So it's quite important as well. Immediately you feel, as soon as you do a course like ours, that, for example, a normal architectural webpage wouldn't work anymore. So it's more like a theatre webpage. And so this development towards that is as well a kind of automatic development rather than a decision we have to look like, and so forth. Yes,
Yeah,
I think
we
we leave
can
the
stop.
movie
Yeah, exactly.
because otherwise we're completely over time. Thank you.
So, hi. I'm actually very happy to follow you because the way you presented what you're doing and this idea of interprofessionality, I think makes my first point, the point I want to start with, quite strong. I know that Mike said that we probably talk about something remote in time, but I would like to start from, I would like to make 3 points, and to start from the first point, which is that we try to consider architecture far from something which we can define the content, and more as a set of situated practices, of discursive formations, of intertwined histories, and of multiple languages. And that's why I thought perhaps we may have more overlaps than we think at first. So in this sense, we interrogate and we work and we are interested in the relationships between words, terms, theories, ideas, practices, materials, as well as the histories and visual languages, various objects, and in this sense, we always are open, right, to define multiple objects of study. And they can be constructed and in different ways. And they can also, the different methods also is something we constantly debate. So in one way, answering to the question of method, I would say that the boundaries of what might be regarded as a legitimate object of study are being constantly interrogated and expanded. And that could be the start of an attempt to define method. Now, in this context, what is the role of history and how we approach history? And history is something we work with. We don't try to study history in its own terms. It's something we try to use as a raw material. So that's why also we say that we look more mainly at the complicit role of history and the writing, in particular the writing of history, historiography, in the formation of ways of thinking the discipline, in the ways of thinking the building, thinking the city, in the ways of making, and also even in the production of the material and the built environment. So, departing from the assumption that history, it has to be a political engagement with the present, with the philosophical, social, material, and environmental demands and issues of the present. What we do is that we read and reread. I would actually use the term reread as a critical practice, rereading as a critical practice. Reread primary texts and contemporary studies and interpretations, and to explore and also unpack and interrogate existing and constantly changing and evolving structures of production of knowledge, to understand the epistemological assumptions, but also to understand their effects. So it's not only that we try to map the existing, what is already there, or the canon, but we do work with the canon in order to deconstruct the canon. We do read as much within the canon as outside of the canon. So it's not that we try to create another canon or a new canon, but we try to go back and deconstruct what is there from within, but also from without. And in this, in order to do this also while we interrogate the premises or some epistemologies or methodologies. We also focus, especially the students through their projects and the multiple writings through the year, we focus on very specific sides of investigation in order to see how they negotiate sources, how they establish paradigms, how they appropriate but also exclude voices, how they shape conceptions and practices of the built environment. And here I have included very, very few examples from recent theses, MA theses, just to show how the students, they focus on very specific conditions, artifacts, questions, moments in history. And it's more important is to use this as a kind of framework in order to pose and investigate a set of questions. So it's not so much to expand the archive, to add to the archive. That could have, and it has its value too, but it's more to use the material and work through the material in order to foreground and also frame a new questions. This from last year, which was, for instance, the focus was on the specifics of a very specific construction method in Israel, the Baranovich method, which was developed in the 1980s. It was on the history and uses of the concrete as a way also to investigate not only material ethics, but also to introduce within that investigation issues and approaches of feminism. And the writing with here brings me to the third point I would like to make, which is how we write, how do we write about, how we use writing. So again, as the engagement with history, writing is more thought and unfolded through the year in seminars, in various assignments, in various exercises, formal and informal, as a project which it constantly demonstrates and transforms, and as a practice of thinking. So we use writing along with other media, but we use writing as a way to articulate both questions and organize and reorganize the material. So writing has a critical role, and here I have this quote just also to somehow give a first understanding of how we approach the element of critique and criticality. And as Judith Butler writes, the exercise of critique typically takes place through the formulation of a set of questions. Can we think, I'm going to the second, and this is always historically specific, that process. Can we think about how, under certain conditions, certain kinds of questions cannot be posed, or rather can only be framed and posed by breaking through a certain prohibition that functions to condition and circumscribe the domain of the speakable? This approach would define the critical in relation to the variable historical ways in which the domains of the speakable and the thinkable are circumscribed. And here is where I would like to close this first part, to say that in one way the writing becomes that act of writing and rewriting, the drawing and redrawing the lines. To understand that actually dynamic material limits, to draw and redraw the lines of research, to also to understand and bring forth infrastructures of living, which most of the times are excluded from the canons. And to work at all these intersections, talking about intersections, where the objects of discourse have less strict boundaries. So here it's more of, again, the different ways of working together. The table, it's very important for us. So we always sit and work and engage and interact and exchange thoughts and arguments and debates around the table. And this is just an image I always find fascinating. John, would you like to
let me
continue from here?
Yeah, this where people thought they would live. I would like to maybe put 3 points on the table today for the discussion. First of all, thank you for inviting us. And the first one really has to do with the notion of what you call situated. I think the condition. It's quite clear that the research turn in design over the last 15, 20 years has moved us away from research as a preliminary to action, largely shaped by what you might call, following my friend Irit Rogov, inherited questions. Now you have a set of inherited questions you need to add to the knowledge. And the action is this idea of expanding knowledge. We've moved in our inquiries around what is research in thinking about design, thinking about architecture, very quickly, I think, to completely new situation where we are research, we are becoming research. That means that we inhabit no longer inherited questions, but conditions. Not where we can aspire to knowledge, but where we can practice how to know, which is the first point. No? We've moved very quickly, and it has consequences. And I think today we've seen in the work of the interprofessional studio and in what Marina said, a lot of attempts to multiple circularities. I'm particularly fascinated by the notion of feedback, that sort of cybernetic memory that AIS somehow carries forward. The second point that I would like to put on the table is that, yes, Descartes, yes, we are as lost as Descartes was. We are as lost as the bishops and cardinals of the 16th and 17th century trying to figure out what is this new earth. Not a new continent full of strange people, have they been baptized, but a new earth that is slowly coming in our imagination as a figure. And here the hypothesis is that the conditions through which we think and practice architecture in the ambit of the research turn, research design turn, are now no longer those of trying to establish moments of stability and establishing spaces, knowledges, environments that are conducive to human action for amelioration of life and bettering our relationship to the, what is it that you call it? What we used to call the natural world. But on the contrary, that is no longer possible to make the distinction. What we've discovered is that all our efforts are now acting back on us. And this is really the rise of this new figure of the new earth in the new epoch of the earth. Peter Haff calls it the technosphere, the Anthropocene epoch. It's really shaping inversion of agency. And in that, I think the entire notion of knowledge in architecture is also reshaped, because we still think that we need to know more in order to act better. A classic modernist trope. Jackie Turret, Konstantinos Doxiadis, the Bauhaus. The more you know, the better you will act. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody saw it coming. Not one single discipline. We can look at it back retrospectively and now start making sense of this. Which poses, and this is my third point, a serious question about the entire notion of interdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity, common disciplinarity, or whatever you call it. We are facing, in a lost way, like Descartes and all those then try to make the world inanimate, a condition where we are seriously trying to put together knowledges that haven't seen the problem coming. And somehow coming together might allow us to do what? And this is really where I think the idea of the inhabiting a condition and trying to figure out what that condition is, trying to understand how do you know, is where a course like the MA in History and Critical Thinking, AIS, the entire research, design, postgraduate, but I think in my experience also really in the foundation first year, is what characterizes the incredible institution that we are in today. Now, there's an attempt done by largely disenchanted architects who work through disenchantment in trying to understand what is the kernel of architecture that we can still push forward. And these are the 3 points. So the first one is, the last one is disenchantment versus interdisciplinarity or interprofessionality. I think that there's a serious condition where our students are ahead of us in being far more disenchanted and disillusioned, in the sense that we don't have a university that can teach anyone how to deal with the complexity and the shock of climate chaos. And at the same time, we are seeing conditions experimented here. How do we keep them together? And the first part, the notion of research no longer as a methodical enhancement of inherited knowledges, but conditions of encounter of knowledges coming at you from all sides. So this is, I think, what I understand the 3 inputs, Mike's AIS friends and Marina bring to the table. I just thought that my little contribution would be towards these 3 points.
Thank you. Thank you both. That's, you can stay there or sit wherever you like. We're going to open for everyone. So there's a lot to unpick there. Just as a smaller point, we are nature. So when I use our relations to the natural world, that includes us. And I reminded everyone yesterday, it's not just the beautiful trees and oceans and creatures that are nature. Strontium-90 is also nature, as are the toxicities that humans have excelled in producing, and that you have so eloquently pointed out are defining our condition. So perhaps I start the conversation and open to you with a question that I think applies to both presentations today, to both teams. That when we view history, we experience it, interrogate it, do things with it, write it in the present. So necessarily, we are both dealing with the present and the ephemeral, because what we do today will become history tomorrow, and tomorrow is, or in 2 days' time is the past. But we're dealing with some kind of relationship between the ephemeral and I think what you call the kernel. What is it that persists? If we are constantly in the present, we're in a particular condition, in your field of work, the object of inquiry is the performance, which is necessarily present. How do we define or work with the relationship between what persists and the ephemerality of the present? So either you can answer this, or you can pass it to your students to answer.
You want to answer? No.
Any of that from that side?
Do you have a volunteer?
Yeah, we like that.
Thank you. Be brave, everyone. It's just, we want this to be an open and
Yeah, exactly.
My straightforward question on this would rather be, do we have to divide time that strictly into present and past and future? I think events from yesterday still have effects on today. So I think separating so strictly creates more problems, because we think we cannot understand the future or the past by living in the present, but I think that's not true. It's like a merging movement, maybe.
Can I say something on that? The idea that kernel persists is a really weird idea. Kernels germinate. They do more. That's what they do. They do more. Why? Because they want to do more. No? It's life. It doesn't persist. It can die. It can multiply. More. They don't stay. They never stay. And this is really the incredible shift in understanding. You might think that you are nature, but is the thought of nature natural then? And in that sense, the ephemerality that you're referring to, is a very short-lived condition. 300 years. 300 years of our concept of nature. That means there's only 300 years in the cosmos where the cosmos is aware of itself. It's extremely ephemeral and fragile. But it doesn't stay. Like any institution, like any condition, it needs to constantly be reenacted, be brought back to a situation, to new knowledges. It cannot move on by itself. It doesn't have any inertia. Engendering, that the kernel does, doesn't happen by itself. It's a very complicated thing that life does by creating entropy. And in a strange way, we don't really get that. And you know about entropy more than any other people in the room, I guess, Mike. But I think this is really the puzzle. How do we start seeing conditions that have so dominated our own practices as being so removed from where we are, so removed from where we live, and this unique condition of one living planet in the cosmos. It's really strange, We have you mentioned, you are the one who brought in Descartes. Inert. Only a world of life.
It's my fault.
No, but think of this, I think, therefore I am. I mean, how do we even start understanding that we are as lost now, because we have to even chuck that out. It's really complicated. But I just wanted to point out, nothing remains. It needs constant reinstantiation, reconnections, and which poses a very strange problem for those of us who are interested in history. Because, of course, history is largely predicated from a Western point of view as the philosophy of history, as the condition through which there is an historical movement, modernity. And we didn't see it coming. Maybe we don't need a philosophy of history, but maybe this is another debate for dinner time.
I think what you said there, with the effect everything has we do today or has happened before, is precisely what in education, but as well as creatives, is one of the main things we can do. In a way, no, we don't have to have necessarily knowledge, but if we are aware that whatever we do has an effect in the environment we live in, it's already a starting point. And therefore, as well, performance is not ephemeral, because actually it has quite a strong kind of moment of affecting things, where it takes place, why it takes place, and what is emerging because of it. At least in our kind of environment, that's how we place it, because you actually can form different common grounds, different kind of overlaps between things in order to create something which is not creating something which is just finite, but actually something which is causing after effect. And so I think that's within this kind of situation we're in, is the only thing we can start being aware of. And as soon as we're aware of that, whatever we do, especially as creating individuals within collective, then we can actually start forming things with it as well, constantly.
And yet somehow there is a kind of faith, I think, that exists within, at least that maybe exists across many people who participate in architecture in their different ways. That somehow there is a contribution or something significant we can do. And it may be that it's focused on providing an understanding of where we are, which I would agree with you that's profoundly lacking of our situation. But it also, what I think, and I don't know if we're the same, so I can't, as previous generations, so I can't argue that it's a persistence. But I think there is a kind of faith that there is some actions we can do that will make a difference to people. Part of me is, I already see that skeptical smile. Part of me is also skeptical, although I'm skeptical made the point yesterday when we were talking about sustainability. That the real problem is that it's not the natural world, if we can call it that, that's not sustainable. It's humans that are not sustainable. And maybe that's enough that we can bring a new understanding that would help to situate ourselves better.
But that's why, Mike, I used before also the term infrastructures of living. It's not just understanding philosophy of history or understanding history or historical formation or discourse formation on an abstract level, but understand also how infrastructures of living change through time. And I think to understand where things, how things came to be the way they are now, I think it's the first step towards that, as you said, action on the thing. So every time we understand, every time we engage with, I think it is a part of that action.
And maybe that's also just the act of being human. Are we anything more than the accumulation of our memories? I don't feel that I exist and I'm thinking and engaging and talking, and part of me has to acknowledge, well, that's also what I am, is the product of all the experiences I've had till today. But still, against that, I just am in today. It is today, and you are here.
I think it really has to do with the notion of aspiration and disenchantment. No, you say there's
aspiration and enchantment is a lovely phrase.
Disenchantment. We are in the studios, in the corridors, in the classrooms. We are hearing the echoes of more and more disenchanted people. And you're saying, yeah, but we still have faith. Yeah, it's maybe the right word. It's a liturgical word. And maybe the liturgy of practices of architecture are to be analyzed and scrutinized. But disenchantment doesn't block. It's not that disenchantment is not conducive to actions, to mutualities, to coalitions. No, on the contrary, I think that disenchantment, as we learn how it is practiced in the school and how all the students are trying really to deal with that, is a condition that allows them to shape different ways of knowing, different modes of knowing that makes them do things and makes them very quickly enter a condition of becoming something different. Now they are becoming something very different, the students. And architecture with that is becoming something very different. Maybe the liturgy needs to be also more sensitive to what architecture is becoming. Very complex, advanced practices, not knowledges, advanced practices emerging, the structures of engagement with how we operate in transforming the city are changing, and I think that a lot of people are alert with a lot of antennas becoming more sensitive. You mentioned the entire idea of becoming sensitive. I think this is really a fantastic moment for a school, and at the same time the worst possible moment for a school, because we have nothing to teach.
Well, I can say in a similar way, I profoundly agree with you and disagree with you simultaneously. Maybe I can move on to a second area of discussion, which has been persistent over the last 3 days. So we desire to be authors. We want to create individually something and we want to differentiate ourselves a little bit from just significantly from our colleagues. On the other hand, we live in and work in collectives. You mentioned the studio, seminar rooms. Everything we do, we're embedded in a collective. So this kind of dichotomy between the individual and the collective is, perhaps I can open and ask people to comment on that, maybe from your experience as a student. Are you an individual? Do you want to better yourself? Is that different from acting and being in a collective? It would be good to hear your individual responses to that. I'm going to start with you.
I would have another question for later. I would have another question to the AIS.
But if you could make an initial response.
I also had another question. I think it does, yeah. I think it is very much about this kind of contradiction of trying to have a unique or individual voice, as well as at the same time be part of a collective, part of a kind of interrelated and kind of common shared discussion. And I think in the two presentations we've seen in kind of from very different lens how in many of the projects actually there are some important overlaps and coincidences which are quite compelling, and I think that's kind of in between writing as a kind of process, individual process, but also performance, but also because it's always a discussion between yourself, but very much so between the peers and tutors. I had a question which I wonder if we could go back to what we started with, which is the term method. And it seems to me when you were talking about that, you were talking about, if you were talking about method, that you were talking about the plural, the non-method, or even anti-method, or even counter-method. And that the most kind of compelling projects at the same time had a somehow clear conceptual structure or even kind of logic, but at the same time they destroyed it in the process of kind of questioning and undermined it as well. And I wonder how do you ensure, or how do you even kind of find rigor, or if we can talk about something as kind of that we could define as, how do you ensure that these steps in the process, or these kind of very different outcomes are also rigorous?
I mean, from our point, the beauty of performances and this kind of festival design, that is always applied. So, as Mike used to say, a thesis is an argument proven by evidence. So this is actually an applied way of doing it. If you have a performance, it's either there or not. There's not a kind of, it has to be tested on everything. It has to be proven on the budget, it has to be timing, you have to get the network right, and all the evidence. So it, of course, can fail, can be a failed kind of delivery, but it is there at that moment to be tested. And it's a proven of concept or disproving of the concept in that moment. But of course moves on because of its way of developing in the next level of ideas and so on and so forth. So I think for us, this applied mode, so that whatever we do has to have this moment of actually becoming realized, is one of the most important testing grounds. But not as a kind of now we're done kind of thing, but as a moment in between in the process to prove then that other kind of things can emerge from it and new initiatives can rise up from it and so on and so forth. Just very briefly answering as well, because it works for this, the individual versus the collective. When we had our first validation, Professor Harmon was her name, was a musician, and he said, like, you're not actually working in a collective, you're working in an ensemble. And the difference of an ensemble towards a collective is that an ensemble depends on every individual. I mean, actually any collective does, but there's very clear, you can't have an ensemble full of first violins, right? Everybody has to give each other space at the right moment. Everybody has to kind of be in a kind of harmony, train together to actually fulfill that kind of ensemble task. But give each other space as well. Take up responsibility at the right moment, give space at other sides. And I think that's how we see it. You can bring it, of course, into discussion of Hannah Arendt, like obviously individuality is not the opposite of a society, it's the kind of base of it. And I think that's what we strongly believe. If everybody would come with the same talent, with the same kind of ambition even, or even the same kind of background, it would become designed by committee, the smallest denominator becoming the result, rather than something which is enriching each other. It's a process of conflict throughout. Because you have to find what are the areas you have to step up to. You have to find the moments where you actually have to step in order to avoid kind of complete breakdowns at moments. So it's this kind of constant training and rehearsing, which is again a term, which is the main practice of collective and individual.
There is in Mike's sequence, it ends with presentation, which is, I think is an important thing. I actually am intrigued by the cybernetic loops of AIS, because the presentation is just a way to have another cycle. But what is interesting in what I think this clarity is really beautifully spelled out in this idea of research is that it needs to withstand scrutiny, and yet it will still be fragile. It will not be rigorous, it will be fragile. No? And this is really strange, in particular if you think of the idea of fragility in architecture. Now, architecture is supposed to be about structures. They're not supposed to be fragile. In particular, in the immediate aftermath of the devastating earthquakes, to be in a school of architecture and say that what they need to withstand scrutiny but be fragile, you might think, what is John talking about? It should be the other way around. They might not withstand scrutiny, but they need to resist, stand up. But the question of fragility, I think, is important because it really has to do with what Marina indicates as the situatedness. You never really know what the object is, and you need to find it. You need to always inquire about it. And I think that's what makes architecture a propellant. You know? It always engages other things. You know? And I really like your clear sequence. It ends with presentation. And it's a public moment. You know? It's a public moment. And I wonder what to present something, or is it bringing it into the present? But that's immediately going to a debate in HCT.
One more question.
Yes, I would like to return to maybe on a simpler mode to the initial question of method, maybe to be answered by the students as well. Thanks for showing what the outcomes were in the past years. I think it's very interesting to see. And while it was clear before, I think it's obvious now that as little as we are not just engaged in writing and reading, you're not just concerned with the performance. So, yes, housing these various artistic approaches under the roof of AAIS, I'm very interested in knowing what is your modus operandi in the weekly or daily meetings that you have? Are you having discussions or seminars, or is it more open in a non-verbal way? So, I think that would really be interesting to see what is the process of eventually doing what you do.
But maybe that's a festival.
Yeah, I mean,
it's food.
I mean, I could explain the sequence of the kind of curriculum we have, but it starts with skilling, because if you work between different disciplines, there are basic kind of skills you want to have in order to be able to contribute or to criticize or completely overthrow a way of working. These are the workshops in term one, which are taken by the hand, we say, with the tutors. So they come from different disciplines, from dramaturgy to writing and so on and so forth. In the second term, it's you are, as a student, are pushed out a little bit further into the water because the event itself you have to start creating. There are tutorials along the way, there are seminars along the way. A lot at the moment, for example, every Monday there are sessions purely on production and kind of organizational things, budget, things like that. Really quite dry things, but to build the basis. Many of those things are needed for communication, especially if you work across disciplines. You have to, as Tanya said, learn the languages of the choreographers now and the dancers to work with. What is the common ground of understanding each other, rather than just experimenting out of kind of improvisation. They have to find means of actually having articulated exchanges to Ben and the team. They need to have clear ways of communicating what they need in order to bring the things forward they creatively and of course into architectural structures. I mean, interestingly, performance is one of the areas where you have almost the biggest restrictions of all, because you have to fire retardant everything. It has to be crowd management, health and safety checks on everything. So it's a lot of kind of real kind of nitty-gritty things which allow the creativity to unfold. And I think that is this kind of interesting area which pretty much every creative field has. You have to have the rigor on the one side in order to unfold then in the creativity.
But then one add-on, so the third term is bringing everything we learned in a UK background, bringing it to international. Now we go to Lisbon now it's a set. Usually, as you could see, the inflatable structure was an add-on for theater plays, but it was our structure, so that needed to be, of course, perfectly done. Now we're going into a theater place, so where all the framework is there in Lisbon, but then as well it's an independent theater, so it's open. So they're open to discussion as well. We will have workshops with the students, with local people as well, to discuss the methodology as well, how the projects we present, how they come together as well.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden new topics come, because these partners in this kind of searching for initiatives is a theatre which looks for a green renovation. So we work together with SED and local kind of players there to find what is a sustainable culture. Because, we all talk about everything is done, but again, in a performative environment, it's often extremely wasteful, high energy material you buy quick and throw away and so on and so forth. But as well, the whole organization often isn't.
Okay, thank you. I think it's 2:10 and we run a little bit over time. But thank you all for being here and being part of this, and thank you very much to the people who have presented and discussed today.
And thank you, Mike, for organizing.
A small conclusion for me is that architecture, and I use architecture with a small a, is something we do with other people and for other people.
Yes.